Thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today, and I'd like to thank Joe Bast and James Taylor and everyone at the Heartland Institute for inviting me. And it's good to see so many familiar faces and catch up on things, and thank you all for coming, and it's good to meet a few new people here today as well. I am going to talk about things that Jim Sensenbrenner brought up yesterday and that Chris Horner continued today. But I'd first like to tell you a couple of little housekeeping things. Heartland and CEI are both members of the Cooler Heads Coalition, and if you are not familiar with it, we publish a weekly energy news newsletter called the Cooler Heads Digest. It has a little bit of science in it, but mostly politics. If you're interested in subscribing to it, Brian McGraw, my colleague here from CEI, has a few copies. We had some at our booth, and you can also subscribe to it at the coalition's website, globalwarming.org, which also has links to all of the 28 members of the coalition. By the way, I do have one bone to pick with Heartland. I've got JD on my, I've been insulted so many times, I'm used to it. I've been called an economist, and now I'm called a lawyer, so before I get started on what I'm going to talk about, I also want to mention something that pick up on Julian Morris's excellent summary of sustainable development. This is a very clever term. It sounds very appealing. But we have caught a break recently. The World Watch Institute, which is one of the long-term promoters of sustainable development, in their annual State of the World report, which predicts doomsday, and they've been doing this for 20-some years now, doomsday in the next few years. The reasons and what doomsday consists in keeps changing, but sorry, someone was dialing me. But every year they put out this report. They have now dropped sustainable development, and they have said we need to degrow the economy. Now, this great outbreak of honesty from the left is something we need to take advantage of, because I don't think degrow the economy sounds quite as seductive as sustainable development. Now, at the first Heartland conference, I talked about what is to be done. How are we going to defeat cap and trade, cap and tax? And by the way, the term cap and tax was coined at one of our monthly Cooler Heads Coalition meetings around 2002. Was it you who coined it? I forget who coined it, but anyway, it took about 8 years to defeat it once we started. And I asked how, I sort of laid out how I thought we would defeat it. And I'd like to do the same today on Obama's war on affordable energy. What is to be done? I wish I had the answer. I thought I had the answer. I think I laid out the strategy fairly well on defeating cap and tax, but I'm not nearly as confident about how we defeat Obama's war on affordable energy. Jim Sensenbrenner gave some of the background, but I want to remind you that it took a long time to defeat cap and tax. There were bills introduced starting in 2002. There were multiple votes in the Senate. It passed the House. Jim Sensenbrenner and his allies failed in 2009 on June 26th by a vote of 219 to 212. But all of those years of effort paid off because the American people reacted rather vigorously. One of the 6 Republican members who voted for the Waxman-Markey bill returned from the July 4th recess and told House Republican leadership, "This was one of the worst weeks of my life." And this is a liberal Republican in a liberal district. The blowback from the American public was phenomenal. Now, one aside is that vote was based on a lot of misinformation, as I think all of you know. And let me just give you one example. Dana Rohrabacher, one of our great allies in the House of Representatives, he's a senior member of the Science Committee, and a global warming skeptic and a surfer. The night of the vote on Waxman-Markey, he returned to the Rayburn House Office building where the more senior members, most of them have their offices, and he said, "I was in an elevator with 3 senior Democrats who had voted for Waxman-Markey and were very enthusiastic and excited." And I just said, well, this carbon dioxide stuff, how much of it is there in the atmosphere? The first senior Democrat said 60%. The second said, no, that's too much. It's only 20%. And the third said, well, you know, I still think that's too much. I think it's about 10%. Now, of course, as all of you know, it's 4/100ths of 1%. Now, this is the level of ignorance that we are dealing with the leaders of our nation. And always keep that in mind. It is very important to realize that the people peddling this stuff know almost nothing. Now, as Chris pointed out, Obama and his allies have pivoted from the rationale of global warming catastrophe as the reason for their agenda to, they've rebranded it as creating a new clean, green energy economy. And recently there has been some discussion on the internet, and Mark Morano, I think, started it, about the credit that the Heartland conferences and all the efforts that have been made to bring out the skeptical side of the science contributed to the defeat of cap and tax. And some people said, well, it had very little to do with it. It was all the costs of cap and tax. Others said, no, the scientific argument, the American public have become skeptical about global warming. I think actually they mostly just become tired of it. I mean, it's, you know, it's the scare of the day, and it's had its day. But I want to say this about making the scientific case, and this is, I guess, one of my key points. I think it is very important to make the scientific case against alarmism, because no matter what the rationale is given, whether it's clean and green or creating jobs, whatever it is, underlying that, the moral superiority that the left adopts on this issue is based in their belief that they are saving the planet from global warming catastrophe. They may not talk about that in public so much anymore because it isn't selling, but that's, when they get together, that's the basis of their confidence and smugness in their own superiority. So I think we need to keep banging away on the science. Now, so let me just say that while we've lost global warming as the rationale, we have not lost the broad ambitions of the environmental left to radically transform our economy and our political society. But instead of this big target, cap and tax, which was fairly easy, I mean, it didn't seem easy at the time considering our resources, our tiny, tiny resources on our side compared to the $100 million plus budgets of the major environmental groups. We now have a bunch of little targets, and Chris has talked about the subsidies and mandates for windmills and solar panels and squirrels and wheels and things like that. And I'm not going to add anything to that, but there are two other parts, and both of them are very significant. The first is the Obama administration's attempt to block access to conventional energy production. And I think you've seen this. We have denied the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. Federal land permitting and leasing for oil and gas exploration has been blocked. Sales have been canceled or delayed. Permits have not been issued for exploratory wells, and so on. Thank you. Offshore areas. We had the Gulf moratorium, and we now have a sort of de facto slow walk on issuing permits for offshore oil. Coal is a bigger target. We have the stream buffer zone rule, which is they're threatening to bring out any time, which will stop a lot of mining under SMACRA. We have an incredible increase in mine safety inspections, which constitute for many mine owners simple harassment. And we, as I think everybody knows, we have the attempt to limit hydraulic fracturing for natural gas production by taking over federalizing state regulation under the Clean Water Act the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. The good thing about the Obama administration's efforts to block access to conventional energy is that there's one factor working against them. It's called private property. Not all of our energy is on federal lands or federal offshore areas, and so we have the great development of the Bakken field in North Dakota, the re-drilling of the Permian Basin in the Southwest, and all of the shale gas formations in the Northeast. So they haven't been totally successful. The third, which is by far the largest threat to our prosperity and our freedom, is the regulatory onslaught that the Obama administration has put together for the use, the burning of conventional energy, of coal, oil, and natural gas. And I had a slide that listed all these, but somehow I only brought the cap to the drive. I can't find the drive. I must have left it in my computer. But let me just say, we have, everybody knows about the endangerment finding and the greenhouse gas regulations. There are a number of these. The first big ones came out this spring, the new source performance standards for, thank you, coal-fired power plants. But we also have a number of others. And when you add all these together, you really see that the economy will be dead in the water if they are able to implement all of them. The utility MACT rule, the boiler MACT rule, the cement MACT rule, the ozone or smog rule, which Chris mentioned has been delayed once the Obama administration realized that promulgating it before the election would be enough to sink any chance that President Obama has to be reelected, because the Manufacturers Alliance Policy Institute estimates that the cost to the economy will be $1 trillion per year. Every year, $1 trillion. This is a $15 trillion economy, or well, it used to be, maybe it's 14 now. The regional haze rule, the cross-state air pollution rule, the cooling water intake rule, and then we have the assault on the use of petroleum products to drive our transportation. We have CAFE standards, which are going to require 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. Yeah, 54.5, think of that. The smart car gets about 35, and that seats 2 people in great splendor. We have Tier 3 fuel standards coming down, and then we have the attempt to impose E15 instead of E10, even though the auto manufacturers can't guarantee the engine. So, just to conclude, what is to be done about this? The problem that we need to think about, and I really am not, I'm here to find out from cleverer people than me some ideas about how we can proceed here. This regulatory onslaught is being, all of these rules, starting with the endangerment finding and the utility MACT rule, are being promulgated without any congressional involvement. They are using existing regulatory authority. They are twisting the laws completely out of shape. They are going so far beyond what was ever intended by the clear language. I mean, a lot of these laws are not very clear, but they're going way beyond the clear limits that Congress set for things like the Clean Air Act. They are twisting them out of shape. And they are doing something that is quite remarkable and is unprecedented in the history of environmental regulation. They are going way beyond congressional support. Every major advance of the regulatory state involving the EPA has always had significant congressional support. They are now going forward when they are having vote after vote overturning their regulation in the House. And in fact, when the amendment was made to block the endangerment finding last year in the Senate, the Democratic-controlled Senate, it got 50 votes. Now, so what they are doing is going way beyond the base of their political support. And I will just conclude with this. It seems to me that if we are going to restore America to a path of long-term, robust economic growth, we are first clearly going to have to get the taxing and spending problem under control. That's necessary. But it is not sufficient. If we don't do something to push back and block these regulations, I don't think we're ever going to get back on that path of 3 to 4% growth per year. Now, the election is going to determine some of that. If Obama is reelected and the Senate remains Democratic, we're going to have a big problem. If Romney wins, we'll have to see. I mean, the indications are mixed. And I think we're all going to have to be very busy pushing and thinking about how to undo and block the regulatory onslaught that has